So patients will call them Mets. They're little Mets in my lung that just don't want to give me up. So I've been at it now for 5 years. The 5-year survival rate when I was diagnosed was 14%. So that 5-year mark matters quite a bit. And another wonderful contradiction is, this is amazing. Like, you did it. You made it to 5 years. And that is absolutely true. What's also true is I'm in really, really tough shape. Like, the Mets won't go away, and the chemotherapy agents that we've tried, I've done radiation and surgery, it just keeps coming back. So I just live with these constant dualities all the time. And that's really been the theme of the last 5 years of my life.
Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching us on our YouTube channel, I'm your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing well. Thanks, Will.
And this week, we have the honor to have with us Amy Lowe. She's an author, managing director for fellowships and nonprofit journalism at the Emerson Collective. She recently released a memoir titled The Brave In Between, Notes from the Last Room. It's a phenomenal book that reflects on her journey living with stage 4 metastatic colon cancer and offers a lot of insight on navigating the uncertainty of the future and trying to find balance between joy and sorrow. So welcome to the show, Amy.
It's such a treat to join you both. I'm a huge fan of your show. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's totally our pleasure. And, you know, when we have a mutual acquaintance that brought me to you, and what was so inspiring and made me want to have you on the show is, so as our audience would know, like my oldest son, who's 10, had a brain tumor removed about 15 months ago. He's about 3 chemo treatments away from being done finally. So praise the Lord. But you know, reading kind of your story, your memoir made me, I don't know, just like feel like I'm part of the small club that you've been a part of for the past several years. So I love, maybe you can kind of start us off by like talk to us about this journey that you've had to go on, you know, dealing with the cancer that you've got.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm going to start with something we all know, but it needs to be said out loud a lot more, I think, which is that, and I speak a lot in metaphors, so forgive me because we're going to bounce around a lot of different visual metaphors. But, you know, all of us are going to go through what I call kind of the woods. I mean, it's inevitable. It's the most human part of our experience. There are some people who I look at and live lives where like they had just this much about tiny little piece of the woods, and others where your heart breaks because they're sort of like Job people. And it's like, how on earth could so many tough chapters, you know, touch one person? And it's nothing that you would wish on anyone, but I think that you would both agree that those hard chapters are the ones that tend to be the most revelatory, the most full of paradox. I mean, it's where I'm so angry and so grateful all the time. And the more that you sort of deepen yourself in that contradictory space, the more you realize this. Well, 2 things. One, this is so consistent with what Scripture tells us. And so when you think, why on earth is this happening? You have to laugh a little bit because you realize, we've been told this from the get-go. Of course this would happen. But also, what on earth am I learning through these contradictions? And so certainly I never thought I would be someone who would write a book. But what happened to me was an elongated version of the woods. And I thought maybe some of these lessons are too important to not share. So that's a little preface. I can jump in and tell you a little bit more about just the pragmatics of what happened with my health, if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm curious, like walk us through like the moment you found out you had your diagnosis,
Yeah.
and kind of like what was going through your head at that time? What were some of the, external things that were affecting kind of how you were feeling? And like, how did you go about processing sort of this new reality for yourself?
Yeah. Well, as you said, when I was 48, I was diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic colon cancer. So a few things. One, at the time, I was too young to be screened. Today, you can be screened at 45. So that's my little PSA to everyone. Give yourself that birthday gift when you turn 45. It's sadly, colon cancer now is the second leading cause of cancer death in the U.S., but it's the most preventable. And it's spiking among even younger adults, 20s and 30s. So I sometimes will say, like, if you think about Chadwick Boseman and Black Panther, yeah, so that's colon cancer. And you're like, what? He seemed fine. And that is one of the great conundrums of this disease, because I also seemed fine. I was just minding my own business. I had no family history, no symptoms. The only little clue I had is I was just really tired. I was getting little fevers, and fevers aren't really like a cancer thing. And I was playing a lot of tennis, and I was having some trouble getting through my matches. And I thought, what's going on? I mean, this is really strange. So I went to my doctor because my gut was a little off, and I'm like, I don't know, what do you think? And she was lovely, and she's like, well, let's just order a bunch of tests. And basically within 10 days, that little fever I had been bothered by had started to really spike. It was like over 102. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've got to get to the hospital. Like, this is really scary. There was a theory at one point that maybe I had an infection, like an abscess or something. And so I am very fortunate. I live very close to Stanford Hospital. Got myself there thinking, this will get resolved in the next 2 days, and then I'll get home. And instead, they ordered some scans and did a biopsy. And yeah, within about 2 days, I was told, just straight up, a hospitalist came to my room. Hospitals are interesting because they're actually not doctors you will ever see again. They sort of enter in and then they enter out, but they often have to tell you really tough news. And I have a little story about how my news was told to me. But he just looked at me and he said, yeah, this is really tough. It's going to come like a kick in the shins. But you have stage 4 colon cancer and you have a 15-centimeter tumor on your liver. And it's really grim. It's really grim. And we think maybe a spot or two in your lungs, but we don't know. And I remember looking at him thinking, wait, you mean I have liver cancer? I mean, why do I have a tumor on my liver if it's colon cancer? I mean, that's how ignorant I was. I didn't know anything. And what I learned was colon cancer typically moves colon, liver, lung. That's how it moves. And the reason I didn't have any symptoms is that the little tumor I had was way up. You know how we used to call it a large intestine, but it's like a big garden hose.
Yeah.
I had a little spot way up in the corner by my rib cage. So I didn't have any symptoms. It was just hanging out there. But they think for as long as 2 years, it was basically like building a shopping mall on my liver. It was terrible. So it just was shocking. I didn't have that period before where you're like, I'm really sick and I'm going to have to figure this out. Not at all. I just thought I had a, quote, tough weekend. And then, yeah, the world just, flips upside down. So
that is so wild.
It's just insane. It's so bananas. The one thing, because I'll mention this as we keep chatting, that's a little different about my case is I immediately jumped into chemo. I met a wonderful team at Stanford and said, we're not going to even wait another day. We've got to get going immediately. Chemotherapy, and here's another little paradox I'll just give us. I feel very, very strongly, and it was also when I told my kids, who were at the time 16 and 14, because they came to visit me like the next day in the hospital. And I said, if you look up and you see that bag of liquid, it's a line into my vein. That is called chemotherapy. We are not going to call it poison. We're not. That is a miracle. And probably, I don't know what, 15, 20 years ago, another person just like me, maybe she was a mom just like me, went through a really tricky trial, and she's given us this gift. Like, that clear liquid is going to save my life. Now, it's a hard miracle. It means I'm going to feel terrible for so long. But let's look at this the way it needs to be looked at. And I don't mean to gloss over it. And it's, but it's not poison. It's a lifesaver. And I really believe what we name things matters. And that's partly what kind of moves me through the grand metaphor of the book. So as it turns out, the chemotherapy worked. That huge 15-centimeter tumor shrunk down to about 6, so it went down by half. And the good news for me, surgeons are really scared of lots of little tiny things. But one big thing, weirdly, surgeons are like, yeah, we're fine. So I had a successful surgery where they took out basically half my liver. But livers are amazing. They grow back. So what I often say now is my gut is better than it was in the beginning. They took out that tiny little corner of my colon. So now I say, I have a semicolon. And by the way, I think semicolons are way cooler than colons, if you know how to use them right.
Yes.
But it's just this tiny little piece. And then this gorgeous brand new liver. And I'm like, hey, this is amazing. I just got an upgrade. That would be amazing. And wouldn't that be a fun story to tell? Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, my story took a turn a few months later. And that little spot we found in my lung became the real story. So what I say to people now is the story of me is the story of my lungs, because we've been dealing with these they're called metastases. So patients will call them Mets. They're little Mets in my lung that just don't want to give me up. So I've been at it now for 5 years. The 5-year survival rate when I was diagnosed was 14%. So that 5-year mark matters quite a bit.
Yes.
And another wonderful contradiction is this is amazing. You did it. You made it to 5 years. And that is absolutely true. What's also true is I'm in really, really tough shape. The Mets won't go away, and the chemotherapy agents that we've tried, we've done radiation and surgery, it just keeps coming back. So I just live with these constant dualities all the time. And that's really been the theme of the last 5 years of my life.
Wow, man. Thank you for sharing that. I'm so sorry for all of it and all the pain that you've had to go through. It's interesting in talking about, you've gotten 5 years. My mother-in-law, she had breast cancer, and then it was in remission. And then we found out that it had metastasized. Mm-hmm. And she has stage 4 that she has diagnosed with in December of 2020. So we're coming up on 4 years. They had originally given her less time, and she has been fighting and really bravely fighting for life.
Yeah.
And has done really well. In that sense, we're all very proud of her. She's awesome. But living with this sense of impending, not impending doom necessarily. That's not really what I want to say, but this sense that it's just always there.
Yeah.
It's always kind of hanging over everything. Yeah. It's always a part of our life, right? As not only her life, which she, of course, and my father-in-law carry the huge burden of all of it that really you can't, it's way beyond anything we have to deal with right now. Yeah. But it's always there, and the conversations are always there. And, one question that I have is about coping strategies and support systems and ways that you've been able to find silver lining or cope with this. And like you said, this obviously, like, all of us have to face death at some point in our life, but it still feels so unnatural and so wrong and so weird.
Yeah.
And how have you kind of dealt with, like, what kind of coping strategies have you used that you would recommend, or even, I don't know, that just worked for you?
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you mentioned the the truth that we all carry, but that we really kind of push out so much, is that we're all gonna, we're all gonna die. So spoiler alert, this is all gonna happen to all of us. Yeah. Some of us are gonna know and have a season of understanding and really living with it. Others are gonna exit fast, and we had no idea that something like that would happen. I have found, for me, and again, it's a very hard thing to sort of put a formula on this, because that's not the way it works. It has been an extraordinary 5 years for me to sort of sit inside what I call, and it's really the core metaphor of the book, the last room. And I feel like I inhabit this room in a slightly unusual way. And it is the way I've found some solace and coping mechanisms. If we're exceptionally fortunate, so this is what we all root for in life, you reach the last room, you've lived a full life. Maybe you're 90. Like, it's wonderful. Who gets to be 90, 95? Like, but if you're there and you're 90 or 95 and you're surrounded by good care and wonderful relationships, I promise you get up every day and you're in the last room. Well, first of all, your knee has hurt for 8 years. I mean, like, you come to that place with a deep acceptance and knowledge. That's a really beautiful, fortunate life. But you're there. Others, I think, well, they get up they get up and they feel great. It's like you guys, like, you feel great. Like, I'm going to go for a long bike ride this afternoon. I feel great. You don't know you're in the last room at all, which means tomorrow you could step off a curb and get hit by a car. We had no idea you were in the last room, and neither did you. I'm in a slightly unusual group, and your mother-in-law might, or your mom might, I forget, is your mom or mother-in-law, might be in the same situation, in that she knows she's there. Weirdly, and this is sort of true of colon cancer, most days I actually feel pretty good, which is bizarre. And yet, it's absolutely true that I'm there. Like, no one, there could be some incredible clinical trial that could pull me out of this, but the odds are not good. And so I've lived with this strange reality of, like, well, first of all, you should never squander something like that. If you're going to live in the most human room of all, because it is the most human room, and you actually feel okay, but you're there, if you don't climb up on that horse and ride it, I would suggest you're missing out. That doesn't mean it's not scary. It can be absolutely terrifying, but I have now borne witness to more miracles. And I'm very quick to point out that the miracles that I see, 95% or more, are what I call the mundane miracles. They're amazing. And guess what? They were just as present. And I don't know what, room 4, 9, 12 of my life. And I missed them because I wasn't paying attention. And when you're in the last room, you see it all. And so what I'm hoping for me, writing ended up becoming very therapeutic. If there's some postcards I can share from this last room and kind of send down the line to others that are living in different rooms, well, first of all, that's about as VIP an exit as you can ever have. I mean, that's amazing. And then I think the second thing is that it's also this just beautiful reminder that I don't want to leave. And one of the things that I've grappled with a little bit, because I'm like, well, look, I mean, this is very different than if a child is sick or maybe someone in their 20s is sick. You'd say, no, 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 it's not right. It's just not right. I'm 53, so I would argue it's still too young. It's still not right. But I'm in that funny crux of like, well, I've lived a long time. I have 2 amazing kids. Professionally, I've achieved so much. I've gotten to write a book. Like, I can make a long list and say, well, maybe it's okay. But one of the things that I've learned so much about even my faith and how God has created us is that we are created people who want to live. We desperately want to live, and we are created that way. I think part of why heaven stays such a mystery for us is because if we had any idea how off the charts fabulous it would be, more of us would be like, I'm out. I want the upgrade. Let's go. And it has to stay mysterious for us because God made us to love living, even when our knee is sore. We're like, no, I love it. Now, what I'm suggesting is for people who are truly well. Like I've had some friends go through some terrible bouts of depression. I appreciate mental illness is a really different space. And so it's easy for me to say, oh, don't we all want to live? Like there are friends of us in our community who are like, I don't know if I want to live. And we have to accommodate and appreciate how that's a precarious space. But even in my last room, most days I get up and I think, I don't want to exit. Like I love living. And yet I've never been closer to heaven. And so I also am like, well, maybe this is going to be great. But isn't that, it's one more little duality that we all hold every day. But for me, it's not abstract at all.
I'm curious, and I really appreciate you writing the book. For those on YouTube, you can see what the book looks like here.
There it is.
Like, I think it's pretty awesome that you decided to write this memoir, kind of chronicling your life, relationships, what have you. I was talking about your book to my wife recently, and I mentioned the whole like infidelity saga that was in the first chapter.
Yeah.
And like, if I could have recorded her reaction, I would have like included that as part of like this interview, because I think it just really kind of spoke to like, what the heck? But I'd love for you to maybe tell us like, why did you write the book? Why did you think it was important? You already kind of alluded a little bit to the fact that you thought it was, maybe somewhat therapeutic for you to write it, but just tell us about the book.
Yeah. And I, thanks for mentioning, because the third act of the book, some people have read it like, okay, this has nothing to do with cancer. What on earth are you doing here? And I'm like, well, it's a beach read. Like, we're going to cover a lot of great things. They're like, oh, well, if you're talking about like a tsunami or something. No, but it is really funny and joyful. Okay, so here's my take, because I went, like so many people got sick, I went looking for a cancer memoir. Very practically on a small level, but I bet you've got enough people that listen to your podcast to know this. So I'm a single parent. I'm going to talk a little bit how my marriage ended. But I was a single parent by shock and surprise. I wasn't somebody who wanted to ever get divorced. I love my husband. And then 4 years later, I got diagnosed. I went looking for memoir from single parents who are facing terrible diseases, because I thought, well, first of all, there have to be millions of us, right? And second of all, we turn questions over in our mind at night that I promise you are different from folks going through terrible health stuff who are in like loving, intact marriages with kids. They just are on a different path. So here's what's weird. I found nothing, which I was like, why is there nothing for us? maybe I didn't look hard enough, but I couldn't find anything. So I didn't think I was the one to write it, but I thought, well, I'm going to start writing a blog and keep people focused on, little updates on health. But I remember thinking, well, I've got a wonderful professional network. I thought, I am not going to waste this. Come for the cancer, but stay for the other stuff, because the other stuff is really interesting. So when I was encouraged to turn this into a book, what I said very clearly to my publisher was, if you're going to understand a health dynamic, what really is happening, so pretend you're looking at this whole story on a stage. What's really happening is that the scene, or kind of like the set, just changed on stage. Like maybe it went from like a kitchen and a living room to like a bombed out shelter or something. Like it all changed. But you know what doesn't change? The people on stage. Like you're still, so any time you're going to talk about trauma or an awful time, and I imagine that you've experienced this with your son as well, what you're really saying is like, it's the people. I mean, yeah, the labs, and we're always looking at how the scans are, but as a practical matter, our life is now about the people and the conversations that matter more, and that frankly can be more hurtful, more wonderful. But it's really about how the reality of the people goes up like a huge level. So I wanted to approach it from that place of storytelling. And okay, new backdrop, cancer is a reality. But what is this? What happens now to my relationships with my brother and my sister? What happens to my kids? It's the people. And so one of the grand surprises of the book is that my marriage had ended a few years before. I call it like the Mack truck backed up over me, kind of a terrible, terrible story. He had embarked on a 3-year affair, and I had discovered all of it, and had no, like I always say, like cancer, no family history, no symptoms, like nothing that would have given me a clue. He was essentially living a kind of a double life. And it was, well, see, now I can say this, and I say this with a lot of care, but by far, the divorce part of my story by far was harder than cancer, by far. Now, I say that with a little bit of care, but I think that your audience is going to understand this. Cancer was a betrayal of my body. A few cells went left instead of right, and we'll never know why. Betrayal in a marriage is a betrayal of you, of the person that you've bet your life on has decided, not only am I leaving, I'm going to betray you. And it's why marriage is a covenant. It's why marriage is a vow. It's why marriage is intended. And again, it's so funny that we use this as like a cliche, but it's not. It's designed for in sickness and in health. That is the project. And so it was just an awful season in the woods, absolutely awful. My kids and I, we had been living in Seattle at the time. I was really fortunate to have a new career opportunity down here in Menlo Park in Silicon Valley. The plan was my soon-to-be ex-husband was going to also move down here, and we were going to co-parent and live near each other. A few months later, he also decided that was a no. He's like, yeah, I think I'm just going to live in LA. I think that's a better spot. And there were just days when it was all I could do to sort of breathe through the days. And I am I'm the daughter of a pastor. So I grew up, okay, in a very kind of beautiful Christian home. I was really lucky that my dad was the kind of dad who was like a pastor who was more concerned about the least of these than those who had power and wealth. I just was really lucky. I grew up in a storytelling family where at Thanksgiving we would always have what I would call the most unexpected people at our table, like the janitor at our church, or my dad managed to stay in touch with a high school friend of his who was mentally really quite diminished, and he would find a way to fly him from Kansas to join us for 3 days at Thanksgiving because we knew he would be alone. You know, like, this is the kind of family I grew up with. So really beautiful, really lucky. And my friends would sometimes say to me that months after I was going through the recovery of the divorce, well, you know, do you feel like you've, you know, forgiven him? And I would say the same thing because I know my language, right? Like, I know my family. I know I've read every scripture I get. I'm like, oh, I totally am there. It's fine. And I would say things like, well, it's a process. I'd say that a lot. Well, I mean, we just, because, you know, he lived in LA, and I said, well, we don't really see each other that often, but do you see what I'm doing? I'm not answering the question. I'm like, well, we're getting better. That's what I would say. We're getting better.
Yeah.
And in my mind, I thought, well, look, I think there will be some fictional day when I'm in my 60s, and I'm going to have a cup of coffee with my ex-husband, and I'm going to look him in the eye. I'm going to say, do you know what? After all these years, I am fully and completely in a place of forgiveness now. And I'm so glad that our lives have been restored. You're good and I'm good and the kids are good. And that was sort of the plan. And then I get super sick. And once you're back looking at that stage and you're looking at it, you're like, oh, actually, only 2 characters on that stage matter now. And that was my son and daughter. And at the time, they were 16 and 14. They're the only 2 kids they're the only ones that matter. And I had to call my ex-husband, of course. And I said, you know what? I'm really sick. And I think you got to get here. And he, by the way, even though he didn't live here, he had a very close relationship with his kids. Like, they saw each other all the time. And I immediately thought, if this is the end, the best parenting moment I can give my kids is they need to see me receiving love and care from their dad, because the 4 of us are going to be walking over a bridge together. And the best thing I can give them is to hold hands, all 4 of us, and to fully and completely look them in the eye and say, your dad is a child of God. Your dad is a wonderful father. I adore him, and you are going to be in great hands. Like, that is the gift that you give your kids if you're facing this most terrible thing. Okay, to get there, you got to reset your whole plan for forgiveness. It's not some cute coffee when you're in your 60s. And that's really what the first third of the book is about, is I didn't get it. I didn't get truly what it meant to fully embrace seeing him as a beautifully made soul in the image of God, and looking at him and saying, as it turns out, I now only see you. I don't see what you did. I don't feel what you did. That is up to you now. You are the one who is going to go, I hope, do the work of sorting out those decisions that you made. All I see is you. I mean, if you know full forgiveness, that's, now, by the way, that's bananas. Like, that's really hard.
Yes.
But if you can get there, can you think about a better gift to give to your kids? Like, it's amazing. So that was sort of the prelude to getting sick. And it's why it was so important for me to write about that.
I mean, that is like so powerful. I'm thinking of like so many people. I'm like, man, when this episode posts, I really feel like they should listen and they should read the book, because, you know, forgiveness is such a difficult thing, and it steals a lack of forgiveness. Bitterness steals so much of us in our life.
And isn't it crazy how we use all this language that we know, but if you really listen, you realize, like, you're not actually talking about forgiveness. I don't know. I mean, maybe you all are closer to like, no, but I thought I could do these little cartwheels out of those conversations.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you have pat answers, or not even pat answers, but you just have answers that can get the conversation rolling in a different direction, can move it along, because no one wants to say, hey, how are you doing? Well, actually, I'm still like seeped in bitterness and hatred. And, I want that person dead, or I wouldn't care if they died tomorrow or something.
Right.
It's like, wait, whoa. Right. But that's how many of us feel.
Yeah.
And trying to work through that is tough, right? And trying to work through. That's why, like, when I see Jesus say things like in the Sermon on the Mount, in the central part of the Sermon on the Mount, when he's talking about prayer and he's talking about forgiveness, help us forgive our debts as we forgive those, right, who sin against us and our debtors. And then he has this almost commentary. I've heard it talked about in some scholarship. It talked about it's like a footnote, because they didn't have footnotes back then. But it's like this exposition of that one line where he says, because if you don't forgive, all right, then your Father won't forgive you. And you're like, oh man, that's so harsh, and there's so much in that to unpack that we don't have time right now in terms of cultural context, in terms of even things that I don't quite understand. But the idea that forgiveness is something that's so key. And so it can't be like that it means you feel good the entire time, or that it's basically a feeling. I think the feeling is a result of the forgiveness, some kind of feeling of peace like you're describing. And you could certainly speak on that. I'm kind of curious about, your support system with your kids.
Yeah.
How have they reacted to the book, to the journey, to everything that's going on? So they're 16 and 14, right?
Yeah.
Which
now
means that they're 21
and almost 19.
So they're like getting there, right? In their, in their adult life. What do they, how do they feel about all this? Have you been able to have those kind of conversations with them?
Such a good question. So one of the, but I'll leap into it. There's just one little truism. So one of the gifts of this last room, a gift is kind of weird because it's a terrible room. But anyway, one of the great ahas of the last room is that I had to come face to face with like the real visceral physicality of forgiveness. And if I was like just cruising along in room 5, I don't think I would be dealing with it. But everything was hinging on this. And it was like, what I was most afraid of, and I think most people going through a hard time when they've been called to forgive someone, is you think, I'm going to be erased from the story. So if I was wronged at work, or I was wronged, in a relationship, or, what you think, if I give you this gift where I no longer even associate you with the choice that you made, I'm going to be erased. I think we all worry about that. But when you are facing a terminal illness and you're like, wait, physically, I might be erased. I'm not going to be around. Who's going to tell my story in the family? And are they going to tell the story of like, wow, she really went through this season of forgiveness? The reality is you have to trust that may or may not be a story that will be fully told. Like that's the grand mystery. And I do think it's the grand gift of forgiveness is do it anyway. Do it anyway. And so when I started writing, I, of course, thought, oh my gosh, get back to that first stage. The two people who are most important are my kids. And I thought, well, I know I'm going to write about forgiveness. For the reader, I mean, I thought, well, look, see, I'm going to have to bring people through the woods to know what they're forgiving. Because if I don't mention that, they're like, well, I don't get it. What's their problem? I mean, he sounded like a nice guy. And yet I wasn't going to do revenge. I wasn't going to rub anybody's nose in it. I think through the course of the book, I worked hard to be very kind and very imaginative, but also I have carried a terrible, terrible wound. So one of the things that I felt very strongly about when my kids were younger, we were divorced when they were, let me think, 7 and 9, I believe. I chose to not tell them any of the specifics about what happened. I wanted to make sure that he was a fully alive and wonderful dad, and that they were going to be able to work with those questions about infidelity and betrayal. I would rather them work with those questions as young adults than as adolescents. I just thought that's just a complicated time. So I kept that space of the specifics rather narrow. I never lied to them, but I just kept it kind of small. I think that was the right decision because they had this beautiful relationship with their dad for all of that. Okay, so then I started writing, and at that point they were 15 and 17, and a little more. So now you've got full-fledged adolescents, you've got kind of almost young adults. And it was fascinating for them. They said, well, and at this point they knew really the full story that happened with their dad. They just said, well, this could cause more hurt. Why would you do that? Why would we want to create more hurt? And I said, well, I'm not looking to cause harm, but I will concede that this may come with a cost. There is no doubt about that. But I looked at them and I said, listen, we are not the only family who's gone through this. We are an unusual family in that we've got this terrible health story that's in the middle of it. And what I want you to understand is the big plot of the story is that my ex-husband comes back and he begins to care for me in a really compassionate, beautiful way. And I said, I think there's an important story to tell other families who've gone through this, who can also still receive this tenderness and go through what is a really rugged, uneven journey, because this is not linear by any stretch. And I said, I want you to know, I'm going to promise you that I'm going to be kind. I'm going to let your dad know what I'm doing. But this is an important story that others have lived through. And I think that I can bring some perspective to it that may be ultimately a source of either equipping or maybe healing that, yes, may make some of our days harder. There's no doubt. But if it's a gift that we can give to others, I would say is a good gift. Now, here's the interesting thing about today. So my son is 21. My daughter is almost 19. My daughter is what I would call the grappler. Like, she's done the hard work. She's gone through a lot of therapy. She's had the hard conversations with her dad. She's like, oh, this is tough. She read the first third. She's like, there's a lot in this I disagree with. You know, she really wanted to get in there and litigate it. And I said, let's do it. That's great. But what we're not going to do is like take out page 42. We're not going to write this by committee. But I said, have at it. Like, let's get in there. And we had a really good series of conversations. The good news is she got to the end, which is, a little spicy. It's why I call it a beach read. And she's like, oh, now I love it because you're just as messed up as everybody. I'm like, I know. That's the whole point. We're all so flawed. So I would say she's truly experienced it. She's wept over it. She's loved it. She's proud of it. She's annoyed by it. She's all of those things, right? Okay, my cute son, who I adore, who's 21, for Christmas gives me this beautiful pen. Like, those really fancy pens. And he said, I want you to have this pen because you're going to sign all your books with this gorgeous pen. And I said, I think that's so great. So I handed him the galley, like the uncorrected book. And he handed it right back. And he said, yeah, no, I'm not reading it. I'm like, you're not going to read the book? And he's like, no, I think so. I'm just going to, someday, maybe not. It's like, okay, this is hilarious.
Yeah, I know.
And I'll tell you what that tells me as a parent. He is on his own path. And It's not because he's not a fan of it. I mean, he will send me notes. He's like, why are you not promoting this more on LinkedIn or, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, but he knows himself well enough to know this could be too hard. And he's really, really close with his dad. They're both musicians. And so he's doing that hard work of being 21 and loving both of your parents. And that's a tricky thing to ask anybody. And I thought, do you know what? Maybe this is a 25 project for you. So I've kind of loved it. Now, it makes it a little awkward because he was at the book events last week in DC in New York. I'm like, do you have a talking point? If people ask you, what do you think about your mom's book? And he was like, maybe I'll tell them I'm waiting for the paperback. I'm like, well, that's one way to, yeah, I know. So I'm just really, really honest when I answer this question. This is not some moment where as a family, we all had a group hug and we said, let's just do it. Not at all. We had a lot of stink eye moments and a lot of like, how dare you? Also, I loved it. Also, I hated it. I'm going to ignore it. Like, I kind of think what we're going through is pretty typical. So I don't sugarcoat much. But what we're doing, I think the theme of my answer here is that we're rooting for each other. We are really rooting for each other. So I'm rooting for my ex-husband, who, by the way, he and I have spoken at length about it. And he's like, I think it's great what you've done. He's like, it's very hard. He's like, these are private moments you put out to the world, but I want only the best for you. So we're all rooting for each other, but we're rooting for each other in different ways. So it comes in the form of a pen, comes in the form of, I hated page 82 to like, oh God, the end is great because you're terrible. I'm like, I know. So, so that's the theme is if you're rooting for each other, something's going right.
I just, that's like so beautiful. And I have to ask, like, anybody listening to this, anybody watching this would not think that you are in the last room.
Yeah, I know.
You've got so much joy, you've shown so much grace, so much strength. And this is the thing that really gets me. So like, we're 45 minutes into the interview, so I'm obliged to mention the word Christian nationalism. So like with Christian nationalism, I think it sort of like perverts what Christianity is actually about. And I could not imagine going through what I went through with my oldest son without having like a level of faith that I can rely on, I can hope on, and a God to pray to. Christian nationalism does sort of distort what I think all of us on this call would agree is sort of the loving nature of the gospel and what have you. So like where are you kind of getting this strength? Like what's coloring, the joy in your life right now? And are there any sort of, writings in particular that you have sort of leaned on to kind of just help you?
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad you brought that up too, because I think at the root of Christian nationalism, which is such a soul crushing era that we're moving through as a country, comes from a place like the DNA of it, or like the original water supply of it, comes from this false belief that there is this sort of exceptionalism to the American story. Now, I will tell you, I adore my country. I have instilled in my children, if you do nothing all in your year, you are going to be people who vote, who pay attention, who have a point of view. You are going to be engaged in this amazing American project. So we are all in on the American project in my family. But this idea of we're set apart, this is a culture that is somehow better than the others out there are meant to be seen with fear and not with a welcoming embrace. some of that came, I think, through some sweetness and some kind of well-intended notions from decades past. But sadly, today, we're living through the darkest corners of where that kind of framework can lead, because it's not grounded in humility. It's not grounded in joy. It's grounded in fear, and it's grounded in power. And if the last room has given me anything, well, first of all, this whole notion of power and exceptionalism just it just blows up. So you're like, oh, well, that's not going to happen. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's the most human place of all. So this idea that some people are going to get some hall pass out of it, like, no, we're all going to be there. I'm just living it in this very, very alive, fortunate way, in that many of my days look and seem kind of normal. But I look at our cultural divisions and our the tragedy that I think comes from both the edge on the right and the left, because both edges have gotten so distorted with this notion of your tribe or your category as opposed to your humanity.
Yeah.
That I see it where I used to be, quote, bothered by it. Now I see it and I think, no, it's destroying us. And so my sense of urgency around that has grown exponentially. I went looking early on when I had that kind of aha moment. I thought, gosh, this is really weird to be like a last room person and to sort of seem okay, but to know I'm there. And I went looking for, because there's a lot of us who live this. And so a couple things. One is that the chapter structure of the book is actually drawn from Philippians 4:8. So I realized, I thought, well, look, I mean, when Paul was at the end of his life, he was in a Roman jail. He used his Roman citizenship. You know, he had all these kind of different cards to play. But he was a last room person. I mean, he probably got up every day, probably feeling pretty good. But he was smart. I mean, he knew, well, look, I mean, I probably only have a few months, left. Caesar's kind of growing close and it's not good. And so this letter he writes to Philippi, his last letter to a church is just, it's my favorite of his letters. I think it's the most intimate. It's the most personal. And you just get the impression he just loved them so much. And I've always loved Philippians 4:8, but basically what he was saying was, I think, as a last room person, he said, look, fix your eyes, fix your heart on what is true, what's noble, what's right, what's pure, what's admirable, what's lovely, what's excellent and praiseworthy. Now, if you sit with that for a second, you think, well, I don't know that anyone's going to debate rooting for lovely. I mean, the risk here is these sound kind of like platitudes, but I would say, no. When you look at kind of the hardest edges of the Christian nationalism movement and you think, well, no, I haven't been to any of those gatherings, but I've watched just enough on TV to see, I don't think there's anything lovely about this. I mean, you're not leading with this place of beauty. You're leading with a place of fear and you're leading with a place of power. And what does it mean to be people who are noble? What does it mean to be people who are grounded in truth? What if we all aim to be admirable? See, I think those are real shifts. Now, that means that we can have healthy, good debates in the center about different policy prescriptions. Those are great. We need good debates. But the farthest edges, to me, is about our character, about how we treat each other. And I bring a sense of urgency to that now that I never really had before. The last thing I'll just say here, because there's so many to choose from. I also went back and read quite a bit of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So most of your listeners will know Bonhoeffer, but so he was a Lutheran pastor during the 30s in Germany. And sadly, most of the German church, the Lutheran church, just was like, yeah, we're just going to stay super quiet about all this. It's kind of scary, this anti-Semitism thing, this Hitler thing, but probably the best thing we can do as a church is just to be super quiet. And I'm simplifying it, but the Lutheran church became an enabler. They're like, we're just going to stay super quiet. And Hitler knew that. He needed them to be very quiet. He needed it. But Bonhoeffer chose not to be quiet. He's like, yeah, I can't be quiet. This is that bad. So he joins the resistance, which is quite a leap, because that's not just speaking up or writing pamphlets. Like, he joined the group that wanted to assassinate Hitler. So he went on quite a leap. Okay, so that's a tricky conversation, but that's where Bonhoeffer ends up, because his faith tells him you have to go there. Okay, so he's arrested, and he's a lost room person, right? So he gets up every day, probably feeling pretty good, but knowing like, yeah, I don't think I'm getting out of here. And he has all these letters that he writes to his best friend and his fiance during this time. They're amazing letters, but one of the letters that really stood out to me, I'm kind of paraphrasing, but he had just gotten word of like, yeah, your case is basically done. Like, he knew he was going to be assassinated in a matter of days. And he basically says, in the hardest spot, when you get this kind of news, so for me, it might be a scan, here's what happens. God will meet you in the facts. That's how it works. And I thought, now that is probably the best nugget of wisdom I could ever get in this last room, because you got to be really brave to let your friends into this room with you. And it's okay for our friends to be like the bright side people of like, oh, you've got an amazing medical team. I'm sure your son's going to be fine. He's going to crush it. Kids are so resilient. Those are lovely things to say, but I think you'd be the first to be like, they're not the bravest things to say. The bravest things to say is, let's talk about the worst possible thing. Let's go ahead and do that. Because when you join me there, you're saying I'm brave enough to now inhabit the hardest place that I have to live all the time. I didn't get a choice, all the time. And if God meets us in the facts, couldn't we live in a Christian world where our most trusted kind of faith friends are also brave enough to meet us in the facts? And if there is like a gem of the last room, like the part of the room that is the most beautiful, it's that table where your bravest of friends say, let's go ahead and sit with that. Let's do that. Let's talk about the hardest thing possible. So I think Paul was one of those people. I think Bonhoeffer was one of those people. There's so many others, but I've looked to them because they've been inspirations for me. And once you really sat with the facts, the interesting thing is you're like, well, we're going to keep going. Like, there's a writer that I quote through the book. You all both might know Frederick Buechner. And the epigraph of the book is, I quote him. He says, "Here is the world. Beautiful and terrible things will happen. Don't be afraid."
Mm.
That's what it is. And the second piece that I quote at the very end, he said, if you believe in the resurrection, then the worst thing is not the last thing. That's just true. And so the worst thing is meeting you in the facts, right? And as people of faith, we get to say, yeah, but it's not the last thing. It's not the last thing. My friends who do not hold a faith tradition, who are also last room friends, I think have a far harder time. Now, to be clear, they do have a faith. They've just put their faith in a kind of a little bit more of a place of chaos, of biological randomness. But I'm like, oh, that's faith. There's no way I could have faith big enough to do that. But I know that I can say in that place of the facts, the worst thing, it's not the last thing. Our story is going to go on. How it will go on, I don't know. That's the scary part. But it can also be the most mysterious and beautiful part.
Man, that's really, really good. This has been such an awesome conversation. And honestly, this is the last question. And you've kind of been giving bits and pieces of this, I think, throughout the conversation. But what is your hope for the book? If you were to kind of bring it into a statement, a paragraph, what is your hope for the book? And even like in the sense, what is the legacy that you want this book, The Brave in Between, to leave for the readers that pick it up, the people that listen to this and they're like, oh man, I want to check that book out? What's the impact that you hope it has, the legacy that you hope it leaves?
So I'll conclude where we began, which is all of us are going to have a chapter of our lives in the woods. I'm just certain of it. And what I hope for the book and these virtues that I mentioned from Philippians 4:8, I think of them as lanterns for the woods. They don't solve the woods. This isn't like some awesome prayer that you're going to like get helicoptered out like that. That's not the kind of faith that I hold. But these lights, these lanterns, illuminate the path of that awful uncertainty that all of us are going to experience at some point. And that my great hope for the book is that people don't think of this as this is a dying book and this is how to die well book. No. The great revelation for me of going through this is those lanterns are so relevant to every single room of our lives. And if we were to live them fully and purposefully and also joyfully, I mean, there's a lot of humor in this book. I am certain fewer of us are going to end up in the last room who shouldn't be there. Like your son shouldn't be going through a terrible, that's horrible. And yet he's giving, even going through these treatments, you all are now a deposit to science that 9 years from now, another little boy is going to get diagnosed and they're going to say, you know what? We know better how to do this now. You know, because somehow your family was part of a bigger story. And when you embrace this larger story, when you realize these virtues aren't just sort of platitudes, but they're actually these gorgeous little lights that we can carry, it changes our grander story. And I think makes our ability to navigate the woods so much stronger and with a place of confidence. And more than anything else, that I hope our cultural fear will begin to go down just a little bit, because we live in a very complicated time now that is ruled far more by fear than it is with a sense of grace and a sense of generosity and a sense of curiosity. So that's the great hope.
That's awesome. So how can people, I guess, stay up to date on your journey? You know, your book, like what are some of the other things, like ways that people can get a hold of you?
Yeah. So I have a Substack. And so I'm still writing for those who are like, okay, this is interesting, but how's her health? And so my Substack is easy to find. It's just amylowe.substack. The Substack is actually called Postcards from the Mountain. So I use this mountain metaphor from the Substack. So probably this weekend or next, I tend to post now about once a month, every 2 months. The book ends where I'm beginning my first clinical trial. So the book ends about a year ago. Holy cow, a lot has happened in the last year.
Yeah.
I'm not writing a sequel, but if you'll understand, like, oh, she's not kidding. Like, it really has gotten dicier in the last few months. But I want to be good about keeping people posted on that. It's such an amazing gift that people I've never met have been signing on, partly just to know how to pray, but also just, I know that they've been sharing it with some others. So if it's helpful at all, that's wonderful. But that's the main place that I keep people posted.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Amy, for joining us, sharing your story.
Yes, thank you.
I mean, I'm touched by it. And I'm positive, all of our audience will be too. And, for those audience members who are praying types, now you have another thing to add to your prayer list. So there you go.
Yes.
Thank you. It's why I'm still here. I mean, the whole chapter on Admirable is about prayer. And it's a lot of fun. And by the way, spoiler, I don't answer any of the hard questions about prayer. But I'm really good at elevating them. And my dog ends up having a pretty cool cameo in that chapter. So if you're looking for neat and tidy answers, I don't know if you're going to get it here. But if you're going to get like, oh, she's keeping it real, that's what this book does. So thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you. And to our listeners and watchers, remember, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we will see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.